The easiest way to lose everything is to let people believe they already know who you are. Malcolm Brooks had learned that lesson long before anyone at St. Augustine Medical Center ever knew his name. Every weekday morning, he parked the same 12-year-old pickup in the employee lot, carried the same worn thermos filled with black coffee, and walked through the service entrance with a quiet nod for the security guard who always greeted him first. The badge clipped to his Navy maintenance jacket identified him as facilities engineering, and that was exactly how everyone treated him. To the nurses rushing between shifts, he was the man who fixed broken lights before patients noticed. To the custodians, he was the one who stayed late when an aging air conditioning unit refused to cooperate during a summer heat wave. To the families waiting outside operating rooms, he was simply another hard-working employee who smiled, held doors open, and never seemed too busy to help. Malcolm preferred it that way. He stopped beside an elderly volunteer struggling with a supply cart and quietly pushed it the rest of the way to the pediatric wing before continuing toward the mechanical room. The volunteer thanked him with a grateful smile. Malcolm only nodded and wished her a good morning. Small acts of kindness never required an audience. His phone vibrated once inside his jacket pocket. He glanced at the screen without slowing his pace. The message contained only 4 words. Board visit tomorrow. No signature. No explanation. Malcolm locked the screen and slipped the phone back into his pocket as if it were just another calendar reminder. A few seconds later, he crouched beside a hallway ventilation panel, loosened 2 screws, and adjusted a loose connection before the rattling sound disappeared completely. A passing physician gave him an absent-minded wave without breaking stride. Malcolm returned the gesture with the same calm expression he wore every day. Across the hospital, the atmosphere felt different on the executive floor. Vanessa Brooks admired her reflection in the glass wall outside her newly renovated office before straightening the badge that now displayed Interim Chief Operations Officer beneath her name. The promotion had arrived only 3 weeks earlier, but she already carried herself as though the title had belonged to her for years. Administrators hurried to answer her questions. Department managers stood a little straighter whenever she entered a meeting. She enjoyed the feeling more than she cared to admit. When Malcolm arrived outside her office carrying a maintenance tablet, her smile faded almost instantly. "You could have asked someone else to replace that ceiling sensor," she said without looking up from the reports spread across her desk. "People notice who walks into this hallway." Malcolm glanced at the blinking sensor above the entrance. "It was marked as urgent," he answered evenly. "It'll take less than 5 minutes." Vanessa sighed, folded her arms, and looked past him toward 2 executives approaching from the elevator. "Just finish quickly," she said in a lower voice. "I have important people coming." Malcolm gave a polite nod and climbed the ladder without another word. Within moments, the faulty sensor stopped flashing, and the hallway lights settled into a steady glow. Neither executive thanked him as they entered Vanessa's office. Malcolm simply packed his tools and walked away. Behind him, laughter drifted through the closing doors. Ahead of him, another quiet morning waited, one that looked exactly like every other morning in the hospital. Only the unread message in his pocket suggested that by this time tomorrow, nothing inside St. Augustine Medical Center would remain the same. The next morning arrived with the quiet precision Malcolm appreciated. At 6:30, the eastern sky reflected across the glass towers of St. Augustine Medical Center, turning the building into a wall of pale gold. Employees streamed through the entrance carrying coffee cups, backpacks, and half-finished conversations about patients, schedules, and another busy day ahead. Malcolm entered through the service corridor as always, greeting the overnight maintenance supervisor before reviewing the digital work orders waiting on his tablet. A faulty elevator button on the 5th floor. A temperature sensor inside. The pharmacy. A loose handrail near the rehabilitation unit. Nothing unusual. He preferred ordinary problems because ordinary problems help people without drawing attention. By 7:15, he had already completed 2 repairs and stopped outside the neonatal intensive care unit after noticing a nervous young father staring through the observation window. The man looked exhausted. Malcolm quietly pointed him toward a family lounge with fresh coffee and comfortable chairs before continuing down the hallway. No one noticed the small exchange except an elderly volunteer who smiled warmly as Malcolm disappeared around the corner. Upstairs, the executive conference room carried a very different energy. Vanessa stood at the front beside a large presentation screen displaying operational charts and budget projections. Department directors listened while she outlined her new vision for improving efficiency. Her voice sounded sharper than it had only a month earlier. She spoke quickly, corrected people before they finished answering, and reminded everyone that accountability would define her leadership. Several managers nodded without offering opinions. Others simply wrote notes. The room had learned that disagreeing with Vanessa often meant becoming the next example during staff meetings. When the presentation ended, she paused beside the window overlooking the hospital courtyard. Her assistant approached carrying a folder. "The regional board confirmed tomorrow's executive review," she said quietly. "They will inspect every department before the quarterly vote." Vanessa smiled with growing confidence. "Perfect. Everything will show exactly how much progress we have made. Then clear out the unnecessary distractions before they arrive. I want every hallway looking flawless." Downstairs, Malcolm knelt beside the pharmacy refrigeration system, tightening a loose connection before checking the digital temperature display. A pharmacist thanked him for responding so quickly. Malcolm simply replied that medications deserved dependable equipment and wished her a peaceful shift. As he packed his tools, two administrators walked past discussing the executive review. One lowered his voice after noticing Malcolm. The other barely acknowledged him. Their conversation stopped until they turned the corner. Malcolm continued working as though he had heard nothing. Near lunchtime, Vanessa toured several departments with a clipboard in hand. She complimented polished waiting areas, but criticized anything she considered less than perfect. A nurse received a warning about supply organization. A receptionist apologized for a scheduling delay outside her control. When Vanessa reached the engineering workshop, she stopped in the doorway and frowned at the shelves lined with replacement parts. Malcolm was reviewing maintenance reports beside his workbench. She glanced around the room before speaking. "This place needs to look more professional. The board cannot see clutter." Malcolm looked toward the neatly labeled storage bins. "Every part is organized by equipment category. It allows faster emergency repairs." Vanessa folded her arms. "Appearance matters just as much as function. Have everything removed before tomorrow morning." Malcolm remained calm. "If these supplies leave this room, response times during emergencies will increase." She met his eyes for a brief moment before turning toward the supervisors standing behind her. "Did everyone hear that?" I asked for a simple instruction, and somehow it became a debate. An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. Malcolm lowered his clipboard without another word. Vanessa walked away, convinced she had reinforced her authority. As the workshop door closed behind her, Malcolm's phone vibrated once more. He checked the screen. The message contained only 3 words. "Arrival confirmed. Tomorrow." The following morning began earlier than usual. By 7 o'clock, every department manager had received the same calendar notification marked Mandatory Executive Assembly. Staff whispered about the unexpected meeting while moving through polished hallways that smelled faintly of fresh coffee and floor wax. Nurses paused beside medication stations. Laboratory technicians exchanged curious looks. Even physicians adjusted their schedules to attend. No one wanted to arrive late when the interim chief operations officer had personally ordered full attendance. Malcolm noticed the unusual pace the moment he stepped inside the engineering workshop. Every maintenance request that was not considered critical had been postponed until afternoon. The building itself felt strangely quiet, as if everyone were waiting for something they could not yet see. He finished replacing a damaged water valve in the surgical wing and wiped his hands with a clean shop towel before placing his tools back inside the metal case he had carried for years. His phone remained silent all morning. That alone caught his attention. At 9:30, an overhead announcement echoed through the hospital. "All department leaders and available staff, please report to the central conference hall." Malcolm closed his toolbox, picked it up, and walked toward the elevator with the same steady pace that had become part of his reputation. Inside the conference hall, nearly every seat was occupied. Administrators stood along the walls while employees from every department filled the remaining space. Conversations faded as Vanessa stepped onto the small platform at the front of the room. She wore a tailored navy suit and carried herself with complete confidence. Behind her, the hospital logo filled the large presentation screen. She thanked everyone for attending before speaking about accountability, leadership, and the importance of maintaining the institution's reputation. Several people applauded politely. Malcolm entered quietly through the rear doors and remained near the back beside two maintenance technicians. Vanessa continued describing her vision for operational excellence before her eyes settled on Malcolm. She stopped speaking for a brief second. Then a small smile crossed her face. Actually, this is the perfect opportunity to demonstrate exactly what I mean. Hundreds of eyes turned toward the back of the room. Malcolm remained still. Vanessa extended one hand toward him. Malcolm Brooks, would you please come forward? He walked through the center aisle without appearing rushed or embarrassed. The room remained silent except for the sound of his work boots against the polished floor. When he reached the front, Vanessa folded her hands and faced the audience instead of him. Leadership requires difficult decisions, she said. Sometimes people become comfortable doing things the old way. Sometimes they resist necessary change. That attitude affects the entire organization. Malcolm listened without interrupting. Vanessa finally looked directly at him. Yesterday, I gave you a simple instruction regarding your department. You questioned it in front of supervisors. That is not acceptable behavior in a professional workplace. Malcolm answered calmly. I explained the operational impact because patient response times matter. Vanessa gave a short laugh that drew uncomfortable smiles from several managers. There it is again. Always an excuse. She reached into the folder resting on the podium and removed a single document. Effective immediately, your employment with St. Augustine Medical Center is terminated for repeated insubordination and failure to support executive direction. A quiet wave of surprise moved through the audience. Malcolm accepted the paper without looking at it. Vanessa continued speaking loudly enough for the entire hall to hear. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. Please surrender your employee identification before leaving the building. Malcolm slowly unclipped the badge from his jacket and placed it carefully on the podium. He looked at Vanessa for several calm seconds before speaking in the same measured voice he had used every day inside the hospital. Are you absolutely certain this is the decision you want to make? Vanessa nodded without hesitation. Completely certain. Malcolm gave one respectful nod, picked up his toolbox, and turned toward the exit. Just before reaching the conference hall doors, he stopped briefly without looking back. Tomorrow morning, this hospital will welcome someone you have all been waiting to meet. I hope today's decision still makes sense when that happens. A few scattered laughs broke the silence as Malcolm continued walking until the doors closed softly behind him. The conference hall slowly emptied, but the conversations did not. Every hallway carried whispers about what had just happened. Some employees believed Vanessa had finally proven she was willing to make difficult decisions. Others quietly questioned why a maintenance engineer had remained so composed after losing his job in front of hundreds of coworkers. Malcolm never looked back as he crossed the employee parking lot with his metal toolbox resting comfortably in one hand. The autumn air felt cool, carrying a gentle breeze across the nearly empty rows of parked vehicles. He unlocked his aging pickup, placed the toolbox behind the driver's seat, and remained still for several seconds before reaching into his jacket pocket. His phone displayed 3 missed calls, all from the same private number. This time, he answered before it could ring again. A calm voice greeted him immediately. Good morning, Mr. Brooks. The board has arrived. The legal team is present. The independent auditors have completed their review, and the trustees are waiting for your instructions. Malcolm looked through the windshield toward the hospital entrance where employees continued moving in and out without noticing him. Thank you, he replied quietly. Has everyone received the updated agenda? Yes, sir. The emergency session has been confirmed for tomorrow at 8 o'clock sharp. Excellent. Keep everything confidential until I arrive. No announcements. No changes to the schedule. Understood. The call ended after only a few seconds. Malcolm placed the phone beside him, started the truck, and drove away without any sign of frustration or anger. Across town, inside a private office overlooking the downtown skyline, a conference table had already been prepared with thick folders, financial reports, legal documents, and sealed envelopes bearing the hospital system's corporate seal. Several attorneys reviewed contracts while senior financial advisors compared audit summaries. A silver nameplate rested at the center of the polished table. It remained turned face down. No one attempted to move it. Back at the hospital, Vanessa accepted congratulations from several department heads who praised her decisive leadership. One administrator laughed and commented that removing employees who challenged authority would improve morale. Vanessa smiled politely, although something about Malcolm's final words continued to echo in the back of her mind. Tomorrow morning, this hospital will welcome someone you have all been waiting to meet. She dismissed the thought almost immediately. It sounded like nothing more than wounded pride. After all, maintenance employees did not receive private invitations from executive boards. By late afternoon, another email reached every department director. Subject line: Emergency board session. Attendance required. Several managers exchanged puzzled looks because quarterly reviews were never changed without weeks of notice. Vanessa frowned while reading the message twice. She immediately called her executive assistant. "Did we request another board meeting?" The assistant shook her head. "No, ma'am. It came directly from corporate headquarters." Vanessa reached for the office telephone and attempted to contact the regional board coordinator. The call went directly to voicemail. She tried another number, then another. None of them answered. For the first time all day, confidence gave way to uncertainty. Meanwhile, Malcolm arrived at a quiet office building several miles away. The receptionist greeted him with a warm smile before escorting him to a private conference room where a dozen professionals stood as he entered. The senior attorney slid a leather portfolio across the table. "Everything is ready for your signature, sir. The transition can begin the moment you authorize it." Malcolm opened the portfolio, calmly reviewed the first page, and signed his name with steady confidence. As the final signature dried, the attorney carefully turned over the silver nameplate that had remained face down all afternoon. The engraved letters reflected beneath the conference room lights. Malcolm Brooks, chairman and sole owner. By 7:30 the following morning, the executive floor felt unusually tense. Department directors arrived earlier than normal, speaking in quiet voices as they checked their phones for new instructions that never came. Every elevator opened to another group of managers carrying tablets, folders, and anxious expressions. The unexpected board session had become the only topic anyone wanted to discuss. No one understood why the quarterly review had suddenly been upgraded into an emergency meeting, and the silence from corporate headquarters only deepened the uncertainty. Vanessa stepped out of her office wearing a charcoal gray suit and carrying a leather portfolio filled with performance reports she believed would impress the board. She had barely slept. Several unanswered telephone calls and unread messages from the previous evening continued to bother her, but she reminded herself that executive leadership often involved last-minute schedule changes. As she walked toward the conference room, two senior directors ended their conversation the moment they noticed her approaching. One forced a polite smile, while the other lowered his eyes and hurried away. The reaction lasted only a second, yet it left an uncomfortable feeling she could not explain. Inside the boardroom, assistants arranged bottled water, financial statements, and name cards around the polished oak table. One seat at the head of the room remained empty. Unlike the others, its nameplate had not yet been placed on the table. Vanessa glanced toward it with mild curiosity before taking her own seat halfway down the right side. A few moments later, the chief financial officer entered carrying a sealed envelope marked confidential corporate documents. He looked noticeably more serious than usual. Without saying a word, he handed identical envelopes to every voting board member, but skipped the department directors entirely. Vanessa watched the exchange carefully. This was not how routine governance meetings were conducted. Across the room, the hospital's general counsel quietly reviewed several legal binders while an independent audit team connected a laptop to the large presentation screen. The opening slide displayed only the hospital system logo above a single sentence. Ownership Verification Review. Vanessa frowned. That title had never appeared on any previous quarterly agenda. She leaned toward the chief financial officer. "What exactly are we reviewing this morning?" He paused before answering. "I believe the chairman will explain everything personally." "Chairman?" Vanessa repeated. She searched her memory. The previous owner had stepped away from daily operations years earlier, leaving the trustees to oversee executive leadership. As far as she knew, no permanent replacement had ever been publicly introduced. Before the chief financial officer could respond, another board member quietly opened the confidential envelope. His eyes widened almost immediately. He looked across the table toward another trustee who was already reading the same document with obvious surprise. Within seconds, Several members exchanged silent glances that seemed to confirm they were all discovering the same information. Vanessa could not ignore their reactions any longer. She reached toward the nearest trustee. "May I see that document?" "I am afraid not," he replied politely. "It will be presented once the chairman arrives." The room grew still. Outside the boardroom, employees continued their normal routines without realizing that something extraordinary was unfolding just beyond the closed doors. Then the executive assistant entered carrying a slim black folder. She approached the empty chair at the head of the table and carefully placed a polished silver nameplate in front of it. Every person in the room instinctively looked toward the engraved letters. Vanessa leaned forward, expecting to read the name of a respected healthcare executive she had never met. Instead, her expression slowly changed as she recognized the familiar signature printed across the first page of the ownership documents resting in the trustee's hands. The name engraved on the silver plate matched it perfectly. Malcolm Brooks. No one spoke after reading the silver nameplate. The silence inside the boardroom became so complete that even the quiet hum of the ceiling ventilation system seemed unusually loud. Vanessa stared at the engraved letters, then quickly looked around the table, expecting someone to laugh and explain that it was an elaborate mistake. No one did. Instead, every trustee remained focused on the closed boardroom doors. The chief financial officer slowly closed his folder and straightened his posture. The hospital's general counsel organized several legal documents into perfect alignment. Even the independent auditors stood beside the presentation screen with patient expressions, as though they had rehearsed this moment for weeks. Vanessa leaned toward the nearest trustee once again. "There has to be some misunderstanding," she whispered. Malcolm Brooks worked in facilities engineering. He repaired equipment. He answered maintenance requests. The trustee met her eyes calmly. That was the position he chose to hold. It was never his only role. Before Vanessa could ask another question, the conference room doors opened quietly. Malcolm entered wearing a dark charcoal suit instead of his familiar maintenance uniform. There was nothing extravagant about his appearance, yet his calm confidence immediately changed the atmosphere inside the room. Every trustee rose to their feet. The chief financial officer stood. The attorneys stood. The auditors stood. One by one, everyone at the executive table followed until the entire room was standing in respectful silence. Vanessa remained frozen for a brief moment before instinctively rising as well. Malcolm acknowledged the room with a polite nod instead of a grand gesture. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here." His voice was exactly the same voice employees had heard for years while he quietly fixed elevators, repaired lighting, and helped families find waiting rooms. The only difference was that every word now carried unmistakable authority. He walked to the head of the table, paused beside the silver nameplate, and took his seat. Only after he sat did everyone else return to their chairs. Vanessa could barely process what she was seeing. Malcolm opened the leather portfolio placed before him and looked around the room. "First, I would like to thank the trustees, legal counsel, and audit team for completing a comprehensive operational review over the past several months. Your professionalism is greatly appreciated." The presentation screen illuminated behind him, displaying a corporate ownership chart. At the very top appeared Malcolm Brooks, listed as chairman and sole owner of the St. Augustine Health Network through a family trust established years earlier. Supporting documents followed one after another. Acquisition agreements, trustee appointments, annual governance certifications, independent audit confirmations. Every page carried official signatures and legal seals. There was no room for doubt. Vanessa slowly shook her head. "I do not understand," she said quietly. "Why would you spend years working as a maintenance engineer if you owned everything?" Malcolm looked toward her without anger. "Because titles reveal very little about character. I wanted to understand how this hospital truly functioned. I wanted to know how patients were treated when executives were not watching. I wanted to hear honest conversations instead of carefully prepared presentations." He paused briefly before continuing. "People rarely hide who they are from someone they believe has no power over them." Several trustees exchanged thoughtful glances. Malcolm pressed a small remote, and another slide appeared showing employee feedback, anonymous surveys, and operational reports collected over many months. "I have spent years observing this organization from the ground level," he said. "Most employees demonstrated compassion, integrity, and dedication every single day. They deserve recognition." Unfortunately, the review also identified serious leadership concerns that cannot be ignored. Vanessa lowered her eyes toward the table as the first page of the executive findings appeared on the screen, and beside each documented decision was a familiar authorization signature bearing her own name. The presentation screen changed again, replacing ownership records with a detailed timeline compiled from internal audits, employee interviews, policy reviews, and electronic approval logs. Every document had been independently verified before reaching the boardroom. Malcolm remained composed as he looked around the table. This review was never intended to identify isolated mistakes, he said calmly. Every leader makes difficult decisions. The purpose was to determine whether those decisions reflected the values this hospital was built upon. The first report appeared beside Vanessa's name. It documented repeated policy changes that reduced maintenance staffing. During peak hours, despite written recommendations from engineering supervisors warning that emergency response times could increase. Malcolm did not raise his voice. He simply allowed the board members to read every page for themselves. Another report followed. Several department managers had quietly redirected equipment budgets toward cosmetic renovations before executive visits while delaying requests involving patient support areas. A trustee slowly removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead as the financial records matched every recommendation from the independent auditors. Malcolm pressed the remote once more. Anonymous employee surveys filled the screen. Comments from nurses, technicians, receptionists, custodians, and junior physicians described growing pressure to prioritize appearances over practical needs. Several statements praised the engineering department for responding quickly despite limited resources. Others described how respectful employees often remained unnoticed while confident personalities received promotions. Malcolm folded his hands on the table. During the past 4 years, I personally completed hundreds of maintenance requests throughout this hospital. Those assignments allowed me to speak with employees from every department without creating fear or formality. I learned far more carrying a toolbox than I ever could have learned sitting behind this desk. Vanessa struggled to maintain her composure. Those surveys were anonymous, she replied. They represent opinions, not facts. Malcolm nodded slightly. Correct. Opinions alone are never enough. That is why every concern was compared with operational records, financial reports, security access logs, and written approvals. The legal counsel opened another binder. Every conclusion presented today is supported by documented evidence. The room grew quiet again. Malcolm advanced to another slide. This one displayed a series of executive decisions made during Vanessa's brief tenure as interim chief operations officer. Several policies had bypassed normal review procedures. Others had been implemented without consulting department specialists. None violated criminal law, but together they reflected a pattern of leadership driven by image instead of collaboration. Malcolm looked directly at the executive team rather than focusing only on Vanessa. Leadership is measured by the people willing to speak honestly around you. If everyone becomes afraid to disagree, the organization stops improving. Several department directors lowered their eyes. They recognized themselves in those words. Malcolm then displayed security footage timestamps from the previous day's public assembly. There was no audio, only images showing employees gathered while one maintenance engineer stood alone before the entire staff. Malcolm switched the screen off before anyone watched more than a few seconds. Humiliation is never an effective management tool, he said quietly. Respect should never depend on someone's job title. The chief financial officer slowly stood. Based on the completed governance review, I move that the board immediately suspend all executive authority granted under the interim operations appointment, pending final restructuring. One trustee after another voiced agreement. The motion passed unanimously. Vanessa remained motionless as her executive identification card suddenly felt heavier around her neck than it ever had before. Malcolm did not celebrate. He simply reached into the leather portfolio and removed another folder. This is not the end of today's meeting, he said. Accountability also includes recognizing those who quietly strengthened this hospital every day without asking for recognition. For the first time since entering the room, several trustees smiled, sensing that the next decisions would reshape the entire culture of St. Augustine Medical Center. Malcolm opened the final folder and carefully spread several recommendation letters across the polished table instead of more disciplinary reports. The atmosphere inside the boardroom shifted almost immediately. For the first time that morning, the presentation focused not on failures, but on the people who had quietly carried the hospital through difficult days. He displayed a photograph of the engineering department responding to a winter power outage that had threatened critical care units too. Years earlier, another slide recognized nurses who had volunteered extra shifts during severe staffing shortages. Environmental services employees, laboratory technicians, reception staff, transport teams, and maintenance workers appeared one after another. None of them had expected to be mentioned in a board meeting. Malcolm looked around the room. Every successful hospital depends upon people whose names rarely appear in headlines or annual reports. They solve problems before patients ever notice them. They deserve leaders who see them, respect them, and give them the resources they need to succeed. Several trustees nodded in agreement. The chief financial officer quietly added notes to the restructuring proposal, while the human resources director reviewed a new recognition program already prepared for approval. Malcolm then turned his attention toward Vanessa. His expression remained calm, neither angry nor satisfied. Yesterday, you chose to evaluate a person's value by the title printed on an identification badge. That decision did not damage my career. It revealed a leadership philosophy that cannot guide this organization forward. Vanessa slowly removed her executive identification card and placed it on the table. Her confident posture from only 24 hours earlier had disappeared. I made decisions I believed would strengthen the hospital, she said quietly. Somewhere along the way, I became more concerned about looking like a strong leader than listening to the people doing the work. I should have asked more questions instead of assuming I already had every answer. Malcolm listened without interrupting. The room remained silent. After several moments, he finally spoke. A sincere apology matters only when it is followed by meaningful change. Accountability is not humiliation. It is the willingness to accept the consequences of our own choices and learn from them. He slid a document across the table. Effective immediately, your appointment as interim chief operations officer is concluded. The board has unanimously accepted that recommendation. However, this organization does not exist to destroy people when they fail. It exists to improve lives, including those who work here. Therefore, the board will offer you the opportunity to participate in executive leadership development outside this hospital system if you choose to rebuild your professional career elsewhere. Vanessa looked down at the document before quietly nodding. Thank you for treating me with more respect than I showed you. Malcolm acknowledged her words with a small nod before addressing everyone else. The remaining executives whose decisions were inconsistent with hospital policy will receive individual performance reviews, corrective action where appropriate, and additional governance oversight. Those who demonstrated integrity throughout the audit will help lead the transition. The trustees unanimously approved the recommendations. There were no dramatic celebrations, no raised voices, and no personal attacks. Only carefully documented decisions supported by evidence and guided by principle. As the meeting approached its conclusion, Malcolm closed his portfolio and stood. One final announcement remains. Beginning next week, I will spend time meeting employees from every department, not as an anonymous maintenance engineer this time, but as chairman. I want every team member to speak honestly about what this hospital needs to become the best place for patients, families, and staff alike. Around the table, expressions of uncertainty slowly gave way to cautious optimism. Outside the boardroom, employees continued caring for patients without realizing that the leadership culture of St. Augustine Medical Center had just begun a transformation unlike anything in its history. 3 months later, the atmosphere inside St. Augustine Medical Center felt completely different from the one Malcolm had quietly observed for years. The hallways remained just as busy, the emergency department still moved with remarkable speed, and the maintenance team continued responding to equipment requests around the clock, but something far more important had changed. Employees greeted one another by name. Department meetings encouraged honest discussion instead of silent agreement. Ideas were evaluated by their value rather than by the title of the person presenting them. Every month, representatives from every department gathered with senior leadership to discuss practical improvements, and Malcolm attended every session with the same notebook he had once carried inside his maintenance toolbox. He listened far more than he spoke. When a young respiratory therapist suggested upgrading aging patient monitoring stations, The proposal received immediate engineering support instead of months of unnecessary delay. When environmental services requested newer equipment to improve cleaning efficiency, the budget was approved because patient care always came before appearances. Employees slowly realized that respect had become part of the hospital's daily culture rather than an occasional speech delivered from the executive floor. Malcolm could have moved permanently into the chairman's office overlooking the city skyline. Yet many mornings he still walked through the service entrance carrying a simple cup of black coffee. The only difference was that everyone now understood who he was. Nurses stopped to thank him for listening to their concerns. Maintenance technicians proudly shared completed projects. Physicians discussed patient care improvements without hesitation. Malcolm never expected special treatment. He expected honesty, and honesty had become the organization's greatest strength. One afternoon, while reviewing renovation plans for a new family waiting area, Malcolm noticed a familiar figure entering the administrative lobby. Vanessa stood near the reception desk wearing professional business attire, though without the executive identification badge that had once symbolized her authority. She had requested a brief meeting several weeks earlier, not to reclaim her former position, but simply to thank the people who had challenged her to become a better leader. Malcolm welcomed her into a small conference room overlooking the hospital courtyard where patients and visitors enjoyed the afternoon sunshine. Vanessa smiled politely. "I wanted you to know that I completed the leadership development program the board recommended. It forced me to confront mistakes I had been avoiding for a long time." Malcolm listened. Quietly, she continued, "I used to believe leadership meant proving I was the smartest person in every room. Now I understand it means creating an environment where everyone else feels safe enough to contribute their best ideas. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to learn that lesson instead of defining me forever by my worst decision." Malcolm nodded thoughtfully. Real character is not revealed by never making mistakes. It is revealed by what we choose to become after recognizing them. Vanessa thanked him once more before leaving with genuine peace rather than regret. As Malcolm watched her walk across the courtyard, he reflected on everything the hospital had taught him over the years. Buildings could be renovated. Equipment could be replaced. Policies could be rewritten. The hardest transformation was always the human heart, yet it was also the one that mattered most. Before returning to his next meeting, Malcolm paused beside the engineering workshop where he had spent countless mornings repairing lights, elevators, and air conditioning systems. A young maintenance technician smiled and asked if he still remembered how to replace a faulty ceiling sensor. Malcolm laughed softly, rolled up his sleeves, and replied, "Some skills should never be forgotten." Together, they walked down the familiar hallway, proving that true leadership was never about standing above everyone else. It was about never forgetting how to stand beside them.